The first letter arrived on the coldest night of the year, tucked neatly into the crack of the old lighthouse door, its envelope yellowed with age but eerily untouched by the salty air. Emily almost didn't notice it as she stepped outside, wrapped in her grandfather's thick wool coat, bracing herself against the howling wind. She had come to this lighthouse on the isolated coast seeking solitude, hoping to heal after her divorce, the collapse of a life she had spent years building. She had expected loneliness, silence, but not letters appearing mysteriously in the night. With a hesitant hand, she picked it up, the paper brittle but the ink strikingly fresh. The words inside were simple yet unsettling. I still remember the promise. Do you? A chill crawled down her spine, but she shook it off as some mistake. Maybe a letter meant for the lighthouse keepers who had once lived here. And yet, the next night, another letter appeared, then another. Each one was unsigned, each containing cryptic messages. The sea never forgets. Neither do I. You were supposed to wait. Who was writing these, and why now? The lighthouse had been abandoned before she arrived, and before that, it had belonged to her grandfather. Had he been the recipient of these strange messages? Or had someone been waiting all this time for a response? Emily began searching the old logbooks stored in the attic, poring over the faded pages filled with names, storm warnings, and shipwreck reports. But there was nothing, no mention of a secret correspondence, no record of an unknown sender. Yet the letters continued, always appearing at night, always untouched by the wind. Then, one evening, a violent storm rolled in. Thunder cracked over the ocean, waves crashing against the rocks below like cannon fire, and that was when she saw him. A figure standing at the water's edge, motionless against the furious sea, staring out as if searching for something lost. Or waiting, her breath caught in her throat. She grabbed a flashlight and ran, stumbling down the slippery path toward the shore, rain slashing at her face. But when she reached the sand, there was no one there, no footprints, no sign of anyone. Except for a single, fresh letter resting on a smooth rock. Tomorrow at midnight. Don't be afraid. Emily barely slept that night, her mind racing with fear and curiosity. Who was this stranger? What did they want? And why here? Why now? The clock ticked closer to midnight, and despite the warning in her gut, she found herself standing at the top of the lighthouse,
gripping the newest letter in her shaking hands. At precisely 12, a light flickered far out at sea. Not from a boat, not from the lighthouse beacon. A small, glowing pulse, blinking steadily in the darkness. Her breath hitched. And then, just as the wind rattled the old glass panes, she heard it, a voice, barely louder than the storm, whispering through the air.
I kept the promise. She turned, heart hammering, expecting to see someone behind her, but there was only empty space. The realization hit her like a wave. This wasn't a game. This wasn't a prank. It was a message from the past, and whatever had been waiting all these years had finally come back. Every morning, Olivia sat in the same cozy corner of her favorite cafe, sipping on a warm cup of tea, watching the world move around her, but her attention always drifted toward the elderly man who sat by the window alone. He was always there, at precisely 8 a.m., dressed neatly in an old brown coat, reading the newspaper with the same quiet, thoughtful expression. He never spoke to anyone, never ordered more than a single black coffee, and always left at exactly 9 a.m. Something about him fascinated Olivia. Maybe it was the way he carried himself, or the quiet sadness in his eyes, as if he were waiting for something or someone who never arrived. One day, unable to ignore her curiosity, she gathered the courage to sit across from him and strike up a conversation. "Morning," she said softly, expecting only a nod, but to her surprise, he smiled a small, tired smile and introduced himself as Mr. Whitmore. Their conversation was simple at first, small talk about the weather, books, and the town's history, but over the next few weeks, Olivia found herself drawn to their morning chats. Mr. Whitmore spoke of a time long past, of a love that had slipped through his fingers, of the dreams he once had but never fulfilled. "Life is strange," he would say, staring out the window. "You think you have time, and then one day, you wake up realizing you let too much of it slip away." His words stayed with Olivia, and soon, Their morning talks became a routine she cherished. Then, one morning, he didn't show up. She waited, her eyes flicking toward the door, but he never walked in. Days passed, then a week, and an unsettling feeling settled in her chest. She asked the barista if he had seen Mr. Whitmore, but he only shook his head. Unable to shake the worrying, Olivia took it upon herself to find out what had happened. A visit to the town's records office led her to a small, quiet apartment where she learned the heartbreaking truth: Mr. Whitmore had passed away peacefully in his sleep. But there was something else. A nurse who had cared for him told Olivia that he had left something behind, an envelope with her name on it. Confused and overwhelmed, she took it home, her hands trembling as she carefully opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter, and as she read it, tears welled in her eyes. "Olivia, I never told you, but you were my brightest moment each morning. Your kindness reminded me of a time when I wasn't just an old man sitting by a window. I have no family left, no one to leave my things to. But I want you to have my most cherished possession, something I never had the courage to open myself." Along with the letter was a small, weathered box. Inside was a faded envelope, addressed in beautiful handwriting, "To my dearest James." With shaking hands, Olivia carefully opened it, realizing that this was a letter from the love of his life, one he had never been able to bring himself to read. As she unfolded the fragile paper, she felt the weight of years of longing and regret. The letter was from a woman named Eleanor, written decades ago. She spoke of her love for him, of how she had waited for him to return, how she wished things had been different, and that she would always love him, no matter where life had taken them. Olivia's heart ached at the realization Mr. Whitmore had spent his life believing he had lost her forever, when in reality, Eleanor had never stopped loving him. He had simply never opened the letter to know. In that moment, Olivia understood the lesson he had unknowingly left her. Life was too short to wait, too fragile to let fear hold you back. With fresh tears in her eyes, she carefully placed the letter back in the box, knowing she would carry his story with her forever. And for the first time in years, she made a promise to herself to live without regrets, to take chances, and to never let time slip away unspoken. Because sometimes, the greatest gift isn't what we receive, it's what we learn. Samantha never meant to steal the book. It was a mistake, a childhood accident that somehow turned into a lifelong guilt she never quite let go of. She was only 10 years old when she borrowed it from the local library, a worn-out novel with yellowed pages and a faded title, "The Stars Between Us." She had read it every night under her blanket, the words pulling her into a world she never wanted to leave. But before she could return it, life happened. Her family moved, unexpectedly. And in the chaos, the book was packed away, buried beneath piles of forgotten things. The weeks turned into months, then years, and by the time she was old enough to return it on her own, the guilt had settled deep in her chest, convincing her that it was too late. What would they say if she walked in after all these years, returning a book that was supposed to have been brought back ages ago? Would they scold her, fine her? Maybe they wouldn't even remember. But still, she never found the courage to return it, so the book remained in a dusty box, tucked away in the attic of her childhood home, as she grew up and moved on with life. Years later, after her grandmother's passing, Samantha found herself back in that old house, sorting through memories that smelled of time and dust. The attic was filled with forgotten relics of the past, faded photographs, old toys, and worn-out furniture, but one box, in particular, caught her eye. It was shoved into the corner, nearly hidden beneath a stack of old newspapers, as if time itself had tried to erase it. When she opened it, the familiar cover of "The Stars Between Us" peeked out from beneath layers of childhood belongings. Her breath caught in her throat as she picked it up, running her fingers over the faded title. And for a moment, she was 10 years old again, curled up in bed with a flashlight, lost in the pages. The memories came rushing back. How she had promised herself she would return it, how she had let the years slip away, and how, deep down, the book had always felt like a piece of unfinished business. The thought struck her like lightning. She had to take it back, not tomorrow, not next week now. It didn't matter how much time had passed, she had to make it right. As she drove toward the old library, her heart pounded in her chest. What if it wasn't there anymore? What if they had torn it down, replaced it with something new, erasing all traces of the place where she had once spent countless afternoons wandering through the shelves? But as she turned the corner onto Main Street, relief washed over her. The library still stood, weathered but unchanged, like a time capsule of her childhood. She hesitated at the entrance, gripping the book tightly as she stepped inside. The scent of aged paper and ink wrapped around her like an old friend, instantly transporting her back to the days when she had sat on the floor between the shelves, devouring stories like they were the only thing that mattered. She walked toward the front desk, where an elderly librarian sat, her silver hair pulled back into a neat bun as she flipped through a worn catalog. "Excuse me," Samantha said, her voice barely above a whisper. The woman looked up, peering at her over the rim of her glasses. "Yes, dear," Samantha swallowed hard, then placed the book on the counter. "I think this belongs here," she said. The librarian picked it up, turning it over in her hands. Her brows furrowed as she examined the cover, then the barcode inside. "My goodness," she murmured. "This book has been missing for nearly 20 years. Samantha braced herself for a lecture, maybe even a fine, but instead, the librarian's expression softened. "Where did you find it?" Samantha hesitated. "I borrowed it when I was a child," she admitted. "We moved suddenly, and I never got the chance to return it. I always meant to, but time just got away from me." The librarian smiled gently. "Books have a funny way of finding their way home," she said, tracing the embossed title with her fingertips. Then, after a pause, she added, "Did you ever read the inscription inside?" Samantha frowned. "Inscription?" The librarian opened the front cover and turned it toward her. There, written in faded ink, was a note she had never noticed before. "To Thomas, may this book remind you that love, like the stars, never truly fades." A chill ran down Samantha's spine. She had read this book 100 times, but she had never seen this message. "Who's Thomas?" she asked. The librarian sighed, a wistful expression crossing her face. "Thomas was a regular here many years ago," she explained. "He borrowed this book more times than I can count. Said it reminded him of someone he once loved, a girl he met only once, but never forgot. He used to believe that if he kept reading this story, maybe fate would bring them back together." Samantha felt her heartbeat quicken. "What happened to him?" The librarian's gaze drifted toward the large windows, as if searching for something beyond the glass. "One day, he just stopped coming. No one knew where he went. It was as if he vanished." Samantha stared at the book, her mind racing. It was impossible. A coincidence? And yet, something about it felt too significant to ignore. She reached for the book, flipping through the pages until she reached the final chapter. And there, nestled between the last two pages, was something she had never noticed before: a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. Hands trembling, she carefully unfolded it. The handwriting was elegant, yet hurried, as if written in a rush. "If you ever find this book, know that I never stopped looking for you." Samantha's breath caught in her throat. She turned to the librarian. "Do you know where he lived?" The woman hesitated, then nodded. "There's an address in the old records. But, dear, it's been 20 years. Samantha didn't care. She had spent her whole life believing she had accidentally stolen a book, but what if she had been meant to find it? What if, all this time, she had been holding on to a story that wasn't just about fiction, but about fate? She took down the address, her heart pounding as she stepped outside. She didn't know what she would find. Maybe nothing, maybe everything. But as she stood there, staring at the book in her hands, she knew one thing for certain: some stories never truly end. Sometimes, they just wait for the right moment to begin again. The train was nearly empty at this hour, save for the occasional passenger dozing off under dim fluorescent lights or staring blankly at their phones, lost in the hum of the tracks beneath them. Evelyn pulled her coat tighter around herself, shivering not from the cold, but from the strange sense of unease creeping up her spine. She had taken the midnight train dozens of times before, but tonight felt different. The air was thick with something she couldn't quite place. A feeling like she wasn't alone, even though the carriage was nearly deserted. She took a seat by the window, watching the blurred lights of the city fade as the train hurtled into the dark countryside. That's when she noticed him, a man dressed in an old-fashioned suit, sitting directly across from her. He hadn't been there when she boarded, she was sure of it. He wasn't scrolling through his phone, wasn't reading a newspaper, wasn't even glancing at her. He simply sat there, staring out the window with an air of stillness that made Evelyn's skin prickle. Something about him felt off. His clothes, for one who wore a three-piece suit on a near-empty train at midnight. And his expression calm, but hollow, as if he wasn't really there. She tried to ignore him, turning her gaze back to the passing landscape, but the eerie silence between them became unbearable. Clearing her throat, she decided to break it. "Long night?" she asked, offering a polite smile. The man slowly turned his head toward her, his dark eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that sent a chill down her spine. "You could say that," he replied, his voice oddly smooth, almost distant, as if coming from somewhere far away. His gaze didn't waver, and for a split second, Evelyn had the unsettling feeling that he was seeing right through her. "Where are you headed?" she asked, attempting to shake off the nerves. He tilted his head slightly, as if considering the question. "Nowhere in particular," he finally said. Evelyn forced a chuckle. "Well, I guess we're all going somewhere," she replied, trying to keep the conversation light. The man's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. "Are we?" His words sent a shiver through her. Something about the way he spoke, so deliberate, so cryptic, made her stomach twist. She glanced around, hoping for another passenger nearby, but the carriage was almost empty, just her and this stranger. The train rattled on, the darkness outside growing thicker as they passed into a stretch of empty countryside. No streetlights, no houses, just endless black. She checked the time on her phone. 12:37 a.m. Still another hour to go before her stop. A loud screech jolted her, metal grinding against metal. The train shuddered violently, the lights flickering overhead. Evelyn grabbed the armrest, heart pounding, as the train groaned like some enormous beast struggling against an unseen force. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the chaos stopped. The train was still moving, but slower now, the atmosphere eerily quiet. She looked back at the man. He hadn't moved an inch, hadn't reacted at all. He was still staring at her, his expression unreadable. "What was that?" she asked, her voice shaking slightly. The man blinked, as if he had only just realized something was wrong. "A reminder," he murmured. "That time is running out." Evelyn frowned. "What?" Before he could answer, the train began slowing down. But this wasn't her stop. In fact, there wasn't supposed to be a stop here at all. The platform outside was dimly lit, all old-fashioned, almost like something from a different era. A wooden sign, barely hanging onto rusted chains, swayed in the cold wind. She squinted, trying to read it, but the letters were worn, faded. The doors slid open with a hiss. No one boarded, no one left. Just an empty platform, waiting. Evelyn turned back to the man, a question on her lips, but he was gone. Her breath caught in her throat. She hadn't heard him move, hadn't seen him get up. Yet his seat was empty, the air around it strangely colder than before. Panic clawed at her chest. She looked around, searching for any sign of him, but the carriage was still as empty as it had been before. Had she imagined him? No, she had spoken to him. She had heard his voice. Then where had he gone? The train lurched forward again, the doors closing with a finality that sent another wave of dread washing over her. Evelyn turned back to the window, her mind racing. But as the train pulled away from the station, she saw something that made her blood run cold. There, on the empty platform, stood the man, watching her, not moving, not blinking, just standing there, his dark eyes following her as the train carried her away. And then, just before the platform disappeared into the darkness, he raised a hand and waved. The coldness in Evelyn's bones deepened. She turned away, squeezing her eyes shut, willing herself to shake it off. But when she opened them again, she nearly screamed. Sitting across from her, where the man had been just moments ago, was an old newspaper, yellowed and fragile. Her shaking hands reached for it. The headline sent a jolt of ice through her veins. Mysterious train derailment, midnight passenger among the missing. The date was exactly 20 years ago, and beneath it, a photograph. A black and white image of a man in a three-piece suit, the same man she had just spoken to. Her breath hitched, her pulse roared in her ears. The train rattled on, but suddenly, Evelyn wasn't sure if she was awake or trapped in someone else's unfinished journey. And deep down, she knew this ride wasn't over yet. The attic was filled with dust and memories, the air thick with the scent of aged paper and forgotten relics, a time capsule of moments that had once been important but were now buried under layers of neglect. Olivia never liked coming up here. There was something eerie about the way the dim light filtered through the small attic window, casting long shadows over the stacks of boxes that held the remnants of a life she was still trying to understand. But with her father gone, she had no choice. It was up to her to sort through the decades of memories, to decide what was worth keeping and what could be let go. She had expected to find old photographs, outdated tax records, maybe even childhood drawings she had long since forgotten, but she hadn't expected this. At the bottom of a battered shoebox, buried beneath receipts and faded Polaroids, was an envelope addressed to her in a handwriting that stopped her breath cold. It was her mother's. Olivia's fingers trembled as she reached for the envelope, feeling the brittle paper crinkle under her touch. The date in the corner made her stomach twist. Her 8th birthday. She had no memory of ever receiving this. Why had her father kept it from her? Swallowing hard, she carefully peeled back the flap and pulled out the folded letter inside, the ink slightly faded but still legible. My dearest Olivia, happy birthday, my love. If you are reading this, it means something has kept me from giving it to you myself, and that thought breaks my heart. Her throat tightened. Her mother had died not long after her 8th birthday, a sudden illness that had left Olivia with only vague, dreamlike memories of her warmth, her laugh, the way she used to brush Olivia's hair before bed. She had always thought she had known everything there was to know about her mother's passing, that it had been tragic but straightforward. But as she continued reading, her heart pounded harder against her ribs. I wanted so badly to be there for you, to watch you grow, to see the incredible person I know you will become. But there are things I never told you, things I couldn't bring myself to say while I was alive. If you are reading this, then I need you to understand. Your father had his reasons for keeping certain truths from you. He loved you, in his own way, but some things, some truths, are too painful to say aloud. Olivia's breath caught in her throat. What did that mean? Her mind raced, trying to recall any hints, any moments from her childhood that might have suggested there was more to the story. But she had always trusted her father, had never once questioned the narrative he had given her. And yet, here was her mother, speaking to her from beyond the grave, telling her that something had been hidden from her all these years. Frantically, she rummaged through the rest of the shoebox, her fingers sifting through old birthday cards, medical records, and other miscellaneous papers until she found them more letters, each one dated on her birthdays. 9, 10, 11, each one signed with the same familiar handwriting, each one filled with love and longing, and yet none of them had ever been given to her. Why? She tore open the next letter, reading through blurred vision as fresh tears welled in her eyes. Olivia, my love, I hope today has been filled with laughter and joy. I wish I could be there with you, watching you blow out the candles, helping you make a wish. I hope you always know how much I love you, but there is something else I need you to know. Something I have been struggling to put into words. I never wanted you to find out this way, but if you are reading this, then it means the choice was taken from me. Your father, he is not the man you think he is. Olivia's stomach twisted violently. She felt the walls of the attic closing in around her, the weight of a truth she hadn't even uncovered yet pressing down on her chest. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the final letter, the one dated just days before her mother's death. This one was different. The handwriting was shakier, rushed, as if written in fear. Olivia, if you ever find this, please don't be angry with him. He thought he was protecting you, but there is something you must know, something I could never bring myself to tell you. The truth about why the letter ended abruptly, the ink smudged as if her mother had been interrupted before she could finish. Olivia's pulse roared in her ears. The truth about what? What had her father been hiding? And why did she suddenly feel like she was standing on the edge of a secret that had been buried with both of them? Her mind raced as she pieced together the implications. Could her father have been involved in something that led to her mother's untimely death? Was there something sinister lurking beneath the life she had believed to be normal? Olivia sat there in stunned silence, the forgotten birthday card still clenched in her trembling hands. She had come here to pack up the past, but instead, she had uncovered something that refused to stay buried. A mystery that had waited for her in the shadows of her childhood, hidden beneath a father's silent grief and a mother's unfinished words. And deep down, she knew this was only the beginning. The garden had once been a place of magic, a sanctuary of blooming roses, vines curling around wooden trellises, and vegetables sprouting in neat rows, all lovingly tended by Daniel's grandmother, Eleanor. It was the heart of their home, where birthdays were celebrated under the shade of an old oak tree, where stories were told in the soft glow of lantern light, where his grandmother's laughter mixed with the chirping of crickets on warm summer nights. But after she passed away, everything changed. The garden wilted, left untended, just as his father did, retreating into himself, burying his grief in silence. Daniel, only 10 years old, felt the loss in a different way, first through the absence of his grandmother's gentle voice, then through the slow decay of the space she had cherished. He would sit on the back steps, staring at the overgrown weeds strangling what was left of her paradise, the once vibrant sunflowers now nothing more than brittle, lifeless stalks swaying in the wind. His father barely spoke anymore, his presence in the house a ghost of what it once was. Daniel missed him as much as he missed his grandmother. Then, one evening, while searching for a flashlight in the attic, he found an old leather-bound book buried beneath a pile of dusty quilts. He brushed off the cover, squinting at the name etched in faded gold letters, Eleanor's garden journal. His heart pounded as he flipped through the pages, the familiar handwriting filling him with warmth and nostalgia. Each page was a record of the life she had nurtured, outside notes about what she had planted, the best times to water certain flowers, even little sketches of the layout she had dreamed of expanding. And in the margins of one page, scrawled in shaky but loving script, were the words that changed everything. A garden is not just a place where things grow. It is where love takes root, where memories bloom, where healing begins. Daniel read those words over and over, feeling something stir inside him. His grandmother had left him more than memories, she had left him instructions, a plan, a way to bring life back, not just to the garden, but maybe to his father too. The next morning, Daniel grabbed a rusty old shovel from the shed, pulled on his sneakers, and walked to the edge of the garden. The sight of the decay was overwhelming, but he gritted his teeth and started pulling at the weeds, feeling the sting of thorns scratching his skin, the burn in his small hands as he fought against the stubborn roots. It was slow work, exhausting and seemingly endless, but as the hours passed, he uncovered patches of soil, small victories in a battlefield of overgrowth. His father barely noticed, sitting on the porch, lost in thought, occasionally glancing Daniel's way but saying nothing. Every evening after school, Daniel returned to the garden, pulling weeds, clearing debris, using his grandmother's journal as a guide. The sunflowers had always been her favorite, so he planted them first, pushing the seeds into the soil with careful precision. Then the roses, the daisies, the lavender. He followed every note in the journal, watering them at sunrise and sunset, whispering to them the way she used to, willing them to grow. Days turned into weeks, and the transformation began not just in the garden, but in something deeper. His father started watching. At first, it was just a glance from the window, but then one evening, as Daniel struggled to repair the broken trellis, his father walked outside, silently picked up a hammer, and helped him set it right. They worked side by side, no words exchanged, just the rhythmic sounds of nails being driven into wood, the creak of the boards adjusting into place. For the first time in months, Daniel felt a connection, however small, pulling his father back from the depths of his grief. As the weeks passed, the garden flourished under Daniel's care. Tiny green shoots broke through the soil, stretching toward the sky. The once barren trellis now supported the beginnings of climbing vines. The air filled with the fresh scent of lavender, mingling with the earthy richness of damp soil. His father began joining him more often, showing him how to properly prune the roses, how to test the soil with his fingers just like Eleanor had taught him years ago. And then one evening, as they sat together on the porch, watching the garden come back to life, his father reached into his pocket and pulled out an old, folded photograph. Daniel took it carefully, his breath catching in his throat. It was a picture of him, no older than 5, sitting in his grandmother's lap, both of them beaming, surrounded by the sunflowers that had once filled the yard. "She would have been proud of you," his father said softly, his voice thick with emotion. Daniel looked up at him, searching his face, seeing the man he had been before the loss, before the sadness. He didn't know what to say, so he just nodded, gripping the photo tightly. By the end of the summer, the garden had been fully restored. The sunflowers stood tall, their golden heads swaying gently in the wind. The roses bloomed in deep reds and soft pinks, their petals velvety and full. The vegetable patch, once abandoned, now bore ripe tomatoes, crisp lettuce, and fragrant herbs. Butterflies danced through the air, bees buzzed lazily from flower to flower, the garden alive with the sounds of nature once more. But the greatest change wasn't in the flowers or the trees, it was in his father. He laughed more now, his eyes brighter, his presence no longer shadowed by the past. Every evening, they sat together, side by side, watching the sunset cast golden hues over their newly reborn paradise. And in that moment, Daniel understood what his grandmother had meant all along. This wasn't just about plants, it wasn't about soil or flowers or fixing something broken. This was about healing, about love, about remembering that even after loss, life continues. He had rebuilt something far greater than a garden. He had rebuilt a bond, one rooted in the earth, in memories, in the simple yet profound act of growing something beautiful out of the ashes of sorrow. Emma never expected a simple dinner to unravel her past. The restaurant was dimly lit, the kind of place where soft jazz hummed in the background and conversations blended into a murmur. She had come here alone, looking for a quiet meal after a long day, the weight of her work week pressing on her shoulders. She barely noticed when the waiter placed the check on the table, distractedly reaching for her wallet until something caught her eye. A small, crumpled receipt, wedged inside the check holder. At first, she thought it was just an old slip left behind by a previous customer, but when she unfolded it, her breath caught in her throat. The date on the faded paper was 5 years ago to the day. Her eyes darted to the bottom, where 2 names were scribbled in casual handwriting: Ethan and Claire. Her stomach twisted. Ethan, her ex-husband. Claire, her former best friend. And beneath their names, a note scrawled in ink that had begun to fade. To new beginnings. Emma's hands trembled as she gripped the receipt tighter. A wave of nausea rolled through her as the memories flooded back. 5 years ago, on this exact night, Ethan had told her he was working late. 5 years ago, she had been at home, waiting, trusting, completely unaware that at that very moment, he had been here with Claire, her best friend, sharing a meal, toasting to something new while she sat at home, oblivious. The betrayal hit her like a fresh wound, sharp and unrelenting. Her heart pounded in her chest as she looked around the restaurant, half expecting to see their ghosts sitting in one of the booths, laughing over wine, whispering secrets they had kept from her. How had she not seen it back then? The little signs, the growing distance, the sudden excuses Claire had started making to avoid her. She had been blind, too trusting, too in love with a man who had already moved on long before he ever said the words, "I don't love you anymore." The divorce had been brutal. Ethan had painted himself as the victim, claiming they had just grown apart. Claire had disappeared from her life without so much as an explanation, avoiding her calls, deleting her from social media as if their years of friendship had meant nothing. Emma had spent nights questioning everything. Was she not enough? Had she done something wrong? But staring at this receipt now, she realized something. She had never been the problem. They had. This crumpled piece of paper was proof that they had been planning their new life together while she had still been clinging to the wreckage of their marriage, trying to save something that had already been lost. The betrayal she thought she had healed from came rushing back with full force. But beneath the sting of it, something else stirred anger. Not just at them, but at herself for ever believing their lies. Her fingers curled around the receipt as she debated what to do. She could burn it, throw it away, pretend she had never seen it. Or she could confront Ethan. She had his number buried deep in her phone, and touched for years, but still there. What would she even say? I found proof of your affair. 5 years too late. Would he even care? Probably not. Men like Ethan never did. Claire wouldn't either. They had moved on, probably convinced themselves they had done nothing wrong. But Emma had moved on too, just not in the way they had. She had spent the last 5 years rebuilding, piecing herself back together after they shattered her trust. And she was stronger now, smarter, wiser. She had healed. Or at least, she had thought she had. But if that was true, why did this stupid little receipt feel like a dagger straight to the heart? She took a deep breath, forcing herself to focus. This wasn't about them anymore. This was about her. She had a choice: let this tiny piece of paper pull her back into a past that no longer controlled her, or use it as proof that she had survived. That she had come out on the other side better, happier. Without them, her lips curled into a small, almost bitter smile. To new beginnings, if that's what they toasted to, then fine. But she would make her own, right here, right now. Slowly, deliberately, she folded the receipt and tucked it into her wallet, not as a painful reminder, but as a symbol. A piece of the past that no longer had power over her. The waiter returned, glancing at her and touched food. Everything okay, ma'am? She looked up at him, and for the first time in years, she felt truly free. Yeah, she said, standing up a little taller. Everything's perfect.
Sometimes, the answers we search for are hidden in places we least expect. For me, it all started with an envelope tucked away in a dusty attic. Maggie stood at the base of the attic ladder, staring at the cracked wooden panels above. Her grandmother's funeral had been earlier that day, and she was tasked with sorting through decades of family possessions. The house was eerily quiet, save for the occasional creak as the wind moved through the old structure. She hesitated, unsure if she could face the memories hidden in those forgotten boxes. But something compelled her to climb. Dust swirled in the dim light of a single bulb as Maggie pushed open the attic door. Among the stacks of faded photographs, yellowed books, and weathered keepsakes, a small wooden box caught her eye. It was unassuming, but when she opened it, she found a single envelope, addressed in her grandmother's elegant handwriting. The name on the envelope made her freeze. Margaret and Turner. It was her name, the letter. Her hands trembled as she opened the envelope. Inside was a letter, dated May 5, 1950, to over 70 years ago. Dear Margaret, if you are reading this, it means I'm no longer there to tell you this story myself. There is something you need to know. Something I've kept hidden for decades. It's about your mother, Elizabeth, and a decision I made that changed everything. The letter ended abruptly, the ink smudged as if her grandmother had stopped mid-sentence. Maggie's heart raced. What decision? What was she hiding? She searched the box for more, but there was nothing else, a hidden trail. Determined to uncover the truth, Maggie spent the next day combing through the attic. She found old journals, photo albums, and even a stack of postcards, but nothing that answered the questions swirling in her mind. That night, as she sat at the kitchen table staring at the letter, her mother, Elizabeth, walked in. You've been quiet since the funeral, her mother said, sitting down across from her. What's on your mind? Maggie hesitated. Should she tell her mother about the letter? Finally, she slid it across the table. I found this in the attic. Her mother's face paled as she read the letter. When she finished, she looked up with tears in her eyes. I never thought she'd tell anyone. Elizabeth whispered. The family secret. Elizabeth took a deep breath and began to speak. Your grandmother wasn't always the woman you knew. When I was a child, she made a choice that changed our lives forever. She left my father, your grandfather, without explanation. She told everyone he abandoned us, but that wasn't true. Maggie stared at her mother in shock. What do you mean? Elizabeth reached for her hand. He wasn't the man she thought he was. She discovered something dangerous and she left to protect me. What did she find? Maggie asked. I don't know. She never told me. But it haunted her for the rest of her life. A clue in the attic. Determined to uncover the truth, Maggie returned to the attic the next day. This time, she searched more carefully, running her fingers along the edges of boxes and shelves. In the back corner, hidden beneath a pile of old quilts, she found a small, locked chest. The key was nowhere to be found, so she pried it open with a screwdriver. Inside, she found a stack of letters tied with a ribbon, all addressed to her grandmother from someone named James. The handwriting was unfamiliar, and the tone was urgent. Maggie, I know what I saw. He's not who you think he is. Please, don't ignore this. Your safety and Elizabeth's depends on it. Maggie's pulse quickened. Who was James? And who was he warning her grandmother about? The man in the photograph. Beneath the letters was a photograph of a man in a military uniform, his face stern and commanding. On the back was a single name, Arthur Reynolds. Maggie rushed downstairs and showed the photograph to her mother. Elizabeth's face darkened. That's him. That's your grandfather. What happened to him? Maggie asked. Her mother shook her head. He disappeared shortly after she left him. I always thought he ran off, but now I'm not so sure. The dark connection. Maggie decided to dig deeper. She visited the local library and searched through old newspapers. After hours of research, she found an article from 1953 about Arthur Reynolds, a decorated soldier turned businessman. The article praised him, but a follow-up piece months later hinted at accusations of corruption and ties to illegal activities. The more Maggie read, the more she realized her grandmother had been protecting her family from a man with a dangerous past. Confronting the past, that evening, Maggie and Elizabeth sat together, piecing together the fragments of the story. She must have discovered his secrets, Elizabeth said. But why didn't she tell anyone? Maggie thought back to the letter. Maybe she thought no one would believe her. Or, B, she was afraid of what he might do. They decided to visit the small cottage her grandmother had moved to after leaving Arthur. The property had been untouched for years, and they hoped it might hold more answers. The final revelation. In the dusty corner of the cottage's basement, they found a safe. Inside were more letters, photographs, and a journal. The journal detailed her grandmother's discovery of Arthur's crimes and her desperate attempt to escape him. It also revealed that James, the man who had written her the warning letters, was a private investigator and her grandmother's confidant. One final letter was addressed to Elizabeth. My dearest Elizabeth, I made the hardest choice of my life to protect you. I hope you'll understand someday. Arthur wasn't the man I thought he was, and I couldn't risk staying. I left to give you a chance at a better life. Please forgive me. Tears streamed down Elizabeth's face as she read the letter aloud. A small act of courage. In the end, Maggie and Elizabeth chose to honor her grandmother's bravery. They framed the letters and photographs, creating a small memorial in the cottage to preserve her story. The truth was painful, but it also brought them closer together. They realized that sometimes, love means making impossible choices to protect the people who matter most. As Maggie stood in the attic one last time, she felt a sense of peace. The letter from the past had given her family a chance to heal and to finally understand the woman who had sacrificed so much for them. The first time Daniel saw the library, it was by accident. He had been wandering the quiet streets of his town, unable to sleep. The night air carried the scent of distant rain, and the streetlights cast soft golden pools onto the cobblestone sidewalks. Everything was still, the world wrapped in a kind of hush only found in the deepest hours of the night. He turned onto a narrow side street, one he had walked 100 times before, but something was different. Nestled between two old brick buildings where he was certain there had been only an alleyway before stood a library. Its ivy-covered walls seemed ancient, as if they had always been there, unnoticed until now. A single lantern glowed above the entrance, casting a flickering halo of light onto a small wooden sign that read, "Opens only at midnight." Daniel frowned, trying to recall if this place had ever been here before. Surely, he would have noticed a building like this. Libraries weren't exactly popping up overnight, and yet, he stepped forward. The air around the library felt different, thicker, like the quiet itself was waiting. His fingers brushed the cool brass handle of the large wooden door, and at his touch, it creaked open just enough to invite him inside. A part of him hesitated, but another part, the one that loved old books and forgotten places, pulled him forward. The moment he crossed the threshold, warmth enveloped him. Inside, the library was vast, much larger than it seemed from the outside. Towering bookshelves stretched toward a domed ceiling, where a massive stained glass skylight bathed everything in soft, blue moonlight. The air smelled of aged paper, candle wax, and something faintly sweet, vanilla, perhaps, or the scent of time itself. He expected a librarian, someone to ask him why he was here, but the place was silent, undisturbed. There was no front desk, no patrons, just an ocean of books waiting in the quiet. Daniel stepped forward, running his fingers along the spines of the nearest shelf. Some books bore familiar titles, but most had no words at all, only symbols in delicate gold script. He tilted his head. How did anyone find a book here if nothing was labeled? Then, something caught his eye. A single book lay open on a wooden reading table, as if waiting for him. He approached slowly, his pulse quickening. The pages were filled with neat handwriting, and then he saw his name, written in ink at the top of the first page. The Life of Daniel Everett. His breath hitched. His fingers hovered above the pages before he turned one, hesitantly. The words before him weren't just a story, they were his story. Every chapter, every memory, written down in perfect detail. The day he learned to ride a bike, the summer he spent by the lake with his grandfather, the first time he fell in love. His childhood fears, his moments of triumph, the quiet evenings spent alone with only his thoughts. But, as he turned more pages, he froze. The book didn't stop at the present day. It continued forward, filled with events that hadn't happened yet. Conversations he had never had, places he had never been. His future, unwritten in his own hand. His heart pounded as he skimmed through the paragraphs, searching for something, anything that would tell him what was coming next. Some of the words blurred as he read, shifting like ink that hadn't fully dried. They were waiting for him to live them. And then, at the very end, a final page. Unlike the others, this one was nearly blank except for a single line at the bottom. "What will you choose next?" Daniel swallowed. A rustling sound broke the silence. He looked up sharply. The library remained still, but something felt different. The bookshelves seemed taller now, stretching further into the shadows. The soft blue light from the skylight flickered, as if the moon itself had blinked. His pulse quickened. He could leave now. Close the book. Walk out the door. Forget this strange, hidden place. Pretend it had been a dream. Or he could stay. Slowly, he reached for a pen lying beside the book. The moment his fingers curled around it, a gentle warmth spread through his hand, up his arm, settling into his chest. It felt right, as if the library itself approved of his decision. He leaned forward, pressing ink to paper. As he wrote, something in the library shifted. It wasn't movement, exactly, but a feeling like 1,000 pages turning all at once, an exhale of something ancient and knowing. He glanced up at the shelves again. Were they always this endless? He had a strange sense that they stretched beyond the walls of this building, beyond this town, beyond time itself. How many others had stood where he stood now, writing their own futures? He thought back to the nights he had spent wondering what was next, feeling lost in the uncertainty of life. But here, with ink and paper, he had a choice. Not just to read what was written, but to shape what would come. Daniel paused, staring at the words he had just written. They felt true. They felt like his. A deep calm settled over him, unlike anything he had felt before. It was as if the library itself had wrapped around him. Not just a building, but a presence watching, waiting, guiding. Somewhere beyond the skylight, the night deepened, wrapping the world in its quiet embrace. The weight of time, of choices and untold stories, felt lighter now. Daniel let out a slow breath. The library had been waiting for him all along, and now, he knew why. Ella had never been on a train like this before. It wasn't the shiny, modern kind that zipped across the landscape with speed and purpose. No, this was an old-fashioned train, the kind she imagined in the tales of people long gone. She had been walking through the forest when she stumbled upon the platform, a weathered wooden structure that seemed out of place amidst the trees. A faint hum vibrated in the air, and then she saw it. The train was there, waiting. Its sleek, silver body gleamed under the moonlight, with windows that reflected the starry sky. Despite its age, it seemed untouched by time, as though it had never been used. No one else stood around to board it, just her. Ella hesitated. There was something both unsettling and inviting about the train. It was silent, like a secret waiting to be shared. The air around her seemed still, as though time itself was holding its breath. She glanced at the platform again, unsure whether she should board or leave. But the train, it called to her. There was a quiet pull deep within her chest. She stepped onto the platform, her footsteps soft on the wood. As she reached for the door handle, it opened automatically, as if it had been waiting for her. Inside, the train was like something out of a dream. The interior was lavish, though the passage of years had worn it down. The velvet seats were soft and welcoming. The soft glow of antique lamps cast long shadows across the narrow aisle. A gentle hum, almost like a lullaby, filled the air. Ella found a seat by the window and sat down. The world outside was dark, the trees long gone, replaced by an endless stretch of night. It was a surreal feeling, like she was moving through a dream, but no sound of movement came from the train. It wasn't as if it was rolling down a track, it felt like it was just floating, suspended in time and space. The longer she sat, the more she realized that the train wasn't simply going nowhere, it was always moving. The trees had vanished, replaced by fields of grass, then desert sands. A quiet fog rolled in, but the train continued without hesitation. Ella glanced at the clock on the wall, but it wasn't moving. Time was frozen. How long had she been on this train? Minutes, hours, days. It was impossible to tell. The stillness around her was both peaceful and unnerving. As she gazed out the window, she saw fleeting glimpses of faces, ghostly figures that appeared only for a second before vanishing. People standing at the edge of fields, walking through fog, all with their faces turned away from the train. The figures never came closer, never waved. They were like echoes, remnants of another time. Yet there was a sense of familiarity, a sense that she, too, was part of this strange journey. Her heartbeat quickened. The train had no destination, no end in sight. Where was it going? Where had it been? A soft voice broke through the stillness. "Would you like some tea?" Ella turned her head. The voice belonged to an elderly woman, seated across the aisle. She had silver hair pulled back into a neat bun, her face lined with time. A kindly smile rested on her lips. Without waiting for an answer, the woman stood and moved toward a small trolley, rolling it down the narrow aisle. The sound of the wheels glided along the floor, gentle and soft, like the whispers of the train itself. "Don't worry," the woman said with a warm chuckle as she poured the tea. "The train will never stop, but it will take you where you need to go." Ella's gaze shifted to the window. The world outside had changed once again, now a vast, open sky, clouds drifting lazily by. A soft breeze whispered through the cracks in the train, bringing with it the scent of jasmine and fresh rain. "Where do you think it's taking me?" Ella asked softly, her voice barely more than a whisper. The woman paused, handing her a delicate porcelain cup. "It's not about the destination. It's about the journey. Time is a cycle, not a straight line. Here, you're free to travel wherever your heart needs to go. Ella took the cup in her hands, the warmth seeping into her skin. She looked down at the tea, steam curling up from the surface in intricate patterns. She could feel her body relax, her breath steady. The train continued its journey, through landscapes that were ever-changing but always calm. It crossed over rivers that sparkled under the moon, climbed mountains where the air was thin and cool, and passed through meadows filled with blooming flowers that danced in the breeze. As she sipped the tea, a sense of peace washed over her. There was no hurry. There was no destination. The world outside might be endless, but inside the train, there was only the present, a quiet eternity that felt like the safest place in the universe. She closed her eyes, feeling the steady hum of the train beneath her, the rhythmic sound of the wheels turning, the gentle sway of the carriage, lulled her into a sense of calm she hadn't known in years. The faces outside the window came and went, each one a reminder that life was a series of moments fading in and out like fleeting dreams. The train didn't stop. It never would, and that was okay. Ella let go of the questions. The answers weren't needed here. For now, there was only the peace of the endless ride, the soft, melodic hum of a journey that would go on forever. And for the first time, Ella smiled, her mind at ease, her body relaxed. She closed her eyes, drifting into the quiet embrace of the night. The train would never stop, and neither would she. Lena had always been a night wanderer. While the world slept, she found peace in the quiet hum of the city, its dim streetlights painting soft glows on the empty sidewalks. Tonight was no different. Wrapped in her coat, she strolled aimlessly, her breath forming misty clouds in the crisp night air. She turned a corner and stopped. There, nestled between two towering buildings, was a cafe she had never seen before. It was small, almost hidden, its sign gently swinging in the night breeze. The cafe that serves dreams, it read in elegant gold lettering. The windows glowed with a warm, inviting light, and a faint melody soft, wistful piano notes drifted from within. Curious, Lena pushed open the door. A bell chimed softly overhead, and the scent of freshly brewed coffee and something sweet filled her senses. The cafe was unlike any she had been to. The walls were lined with shelves filled with old books, their spines worn from use. Delicate chandeliers cast a golden glow over the round wooden tables, where a few patrons sat in comfortable silence, sipping their drinks. An elderly man behind the counter looked up as she entered, his face creased with gentle wisdom. He wore a simple vest over a white shirt, his sleeves neatly rolled up. "Welcome, traveler," he said, his voice soothing. "A first-time visitor, I see." Lena hesitated but stepped closer. "I didn't know this cafe existed. I walk this street often." The old man smiled knowingly. "That's because it only appears when it's needed. And only to those who are searching for something whether they realize it or not." A strange shiver ran down her spine, but it wasn't unpleasant. There was something magical about this place, something timeless. She glanced at the chalkboard menu behind the counter, but unlike a normal cafe, it didn't list coffee or tea. Instead, it had words like serenity, lost memory, courage, closure. Lena frowned. What kind of cafe is this? "One that serves what your heart desires most," the man replied. "Tell me, what do you seek tonight?" She hesitated, unsure how to answer. The past few months had been a blur of sleepless nights, tangled thoughts, and a persistent sense of something missing. She had tried to move forward, but something unseen always held her back. "Peace," she murmured. "I think I need peace." The old man nodded and turned toward the rows of delicate porcelain cups behind him. He selected one, a midnight blue cup with silver patterns swirling like constellations. With careful hands, he filled it from an ornate silver kettle. A fragrant steam curled into the air, carrying a scent Lena couldn't quite place, something familiar yet distant, like a forgotten lullaby. He set the cup before her. "Drink, and let the cafe do the rest." Lena hesitated for only a moment before lifting the cup to her lips. The warmth spread through her, settling deep in her chest. As she swallowed, the cafe around her seemed to shift. The soft piano music grew distant, and the golden glow of the chandeliers dimmed. The air became lighter, almost weightless. Then, she was somewhere else. She stood in a field of tall grass, swaying under a sky of endless stars. A gentle breeze brushed her cheek, carrying whispers she couldn't quite understand. In the distance, a figure appeared, a young woman, her features blurred by time. Lena's breath caught in her throat. She knew this place, and she knew that figure. It was her mother, standing just as she had in one of Lena's earliest memories. She had been so small then, grasping her mother's hand as they watched the fireflies dance. But this wasn't just a memory, it was something more. The air hummed with quiet energy, as if the past and present had entwined in this single moment. Her mother turned, smiling softly. "You've been searching for something, my love. But you never lost it. It's been with you all along." Lena's eyes burned, but no tears fell. A deep, quiet warmth filled her chest, soothing the ache she hadn't realized she carried. The field around her blurred, and the gentle hum of the cafe returned. She blinked. The porcelain cup was still in her hands, now empty. The cafe was just as it had been, the quiet melody still playing, the golden glow still warm. The old man watched her with knowing eyes. "Did you find what you were looking for?" he asked softly. Lena exhaled, a deep and steady breath. "Yes." She placed the cup down carefully, as if waking from a dream she didn't want to forget. Standing, she reached into her pocket, but the old man shook his head. "Payment isn't necessary here," he said. "Just remember, this cafe will always be here when you need it." Lena nodded, her heart lighter than it had been in years. As she stepped outside, the crisp night air greeted her. She turned, expecting to see the cafe's warm glow behind her, but it was gone. Only the quiet street remained, the stars twinkling above. She stood there for a moment, then smiled softly to herself. The cafe might have vanished, but its warmth remained within her, settling deep into the places that had once been cold. And for the first time in a long while, Lena felt at peace. As she walked home, she knew she would sleep soundly tonight.